Hello, my name is Harbalan. I am journalist, international journalist, and I will be the moderator of today's event, which is called Ukrainian EU Negotiation Reality. That is the presentation of discussion and research that was conducted by Ukrainian Center for Independent Political Research and War Observe. And as you know, last year in June there was the first peace summit, and Ukraine was a member, and more than 100 countries and international organizations participated there, and Russian-Ukrainian wars lasting since 2014. But altogether with that, we see the attempts of certain countries, in particular Turkey, countries of other places. We see some negotiation frameworks and plans from such countries as China, Brazil, Southern Africa. But altogether, the war is going on, and the main goal of today's event is to discuss the results of the research, as well as to analyze the negotiations regarding Russian and Ukrainian war and the formats, how to end this war from several perspectives, from the point of view of European point of view, Turkish point of view of the USA and Russian Federation, and briefly about these four perspectives. Actually, after Donald Trump has come to power in the USA, Russia started wanting direct negotiations between Moscow and Washington, and we're the odd one out, but altogether with that, we see that European countries want to be engaged in negotiations. Why Turkey is important? Because that is where the negotiations happened in March 2022, and we can see that there were 3 rounds of negotiations this year in Turkey already. American perspective is very important because the USA nowadays, they want to be engaged, even though there is some specifics of Trump's administration. And it's also important to take a look what Russia wants to achieve via these negotiations. And I'd like to invite to the floor Valeria Skvortsova and Bogdan Bondarenko so that they can present the results of this research. So please, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Igor. Before presenting the results, I would like to tell the pre-story. The idea about the research was after the first peace summit. It had significant results. Of course, we did not succeed in everything as planned, but it was a big international platform that had more than 100 representatives of foreign states and international organizations. However, geopolitical reality is changing rapidly, and the role of our partners is changing, and the role of political players. Indeed, the elections in the USA have significantly impacted the negotiation processes that are happening, and now we can see that the leadership indeed is with the American negotiation initiative. So for this research to be more relevant, we included the analysis of American negotiation initiative. I'd like to say that in this research participated 21 Ukrainian and international experts, and also I'd like to thank all of them for their input into this research. And we will start with the fact that primarily we asked experts to assess the summit to see the strengths and weaknesses. Well, of course, the main strength is consolidation of international support for Ukraine, because we could collect quite a lot of international players, and also that's presentation and global presentation of Ukrainian formula of peace, which is also the benefit for Ukraine. And also Summit of Peace became a very important tool for Ukraine in order to support Ukrainian and Russian war highlighting in media, because now we see that a lot of different events are happening in the world, and here we could, at least for a certain period, an informational world agenda, we can show that this war exists and that Russia is the aggressor state. Also, one of the perspectives of summit was to establish some guarantees of safety for Ukraine and also building peace from the point of view of the rule of law. That could have been a good platform in order to confirm that principles of international law have to be in the basis of regulating such conflicts. Summit has also certain weaknesses. Well, of course, now when American negotiation initiative has come, summit is losing its relevance. We don't know clear dates, we don't know clear format that will be there. We actually don't know whether it will happen at all. And we cannot exclude its existence fully, but again, there is not many chances that it will happen. Then also, another moment is that the format of the summit excludes certain mechanisms of kind of pushing towards implementation, its solutions and decisions developed as a result of the summit. Another risk for Ukraine might be the risk of imposing the bad conditions for peace. It might lead to some temporary kind of freezing war, and then it might not be helpful in terms of building the long-term peace. Also, we know for sure that this platform will be used for promoting own interests and creation of own coalition of countries that will support Russian point of view in terms of war and kind of self-defense point of view, which actually it is not, and imposing unfair and not beneficial conditions to Ukraine in terms of negotiation. Separately, we assess the role of Russia in this summit, how realistic it is, how efficient it is, and almost all the experts have mentioned that, well, it is not a desirable perspective, because taking a look at the actions of Russia that are there as of now, we don't see the necessity. We don't see their desire for peace, because the terror continues and their attacks on the front line continue, and then also the blackmail with the massive weapons, they continue these threats. So quite often there are some public signals that Russia doesn't recognize the legitimacy of Ukrainian authorities. They don't see Ukraine as equal partner. Therefore, they will insist on the fact that we need negotiations with other authorities and other presidents. So all of that is stating that Russian authorities just consider Ukraine as a territory without certain sovereignty and independence. This will be mentioned. Maybe that will be one of the conditions of peaceful negotiations in the future. What else is Russia using in order to promote their own narratives and interests? It is the so-called peace offensive concept that is creating illusion of readiness to negotiations, but actually it is like postponing that manipulation with public opinion in order to put the war on hold, just regroup their forces and continue. Russia will ask for weakening sanctions, reducing international pressure, and they will continue blaming Ukraine in unwillingness to conduct the negotiations. And they want to have our capitulation. It's not a compromise. They want to have it on their conditions. Can I ask the brief question? Have you considered the Chinese factor in last year's peace summit? No, we have not considered China separately. However, it's a good topic for further researchers, and I think we should dive deeper into that. Yeah, I do understand that I need to speed up. Okay, what else? Russia is strengthening the right moods in Europe, etc. But we see these tendencies, and Russia is involved into support of such radical movements, creating the so-called allies on the territory of the European Union and the USA, because further on, of course, they will promote and support Russian interests. They will see friends for further cooperation, and also they will cause further pressure on Ukraine for a capitulation. Now, the right of power is prevailing, kind of. In this reality, we cannot talk about honest and diplomatic solutions for this war. Then also, Russia is actively using weaknesses of Western democracies, manipulation of the freedom of speech, impact via media, via weakness of institutions, strengthening internal destabilization, and also in this manner they are promoting their own narratives. At the end, I'd like to mention that we were also talking about the challenges that Ukraine might face in case of participation of Russia in this summit. The main challenge actually is that any agreements that will be created in the framework of this summit, most probably they won't be accepted by Russia because the mechanism, well, does not have certain pressure on Russia, and historical practice shows that very often Russia is not doing the things that they promised. The blackmail by children, military captives, energy blackmail might be used. Use of their own diaspora as soft power, which actually is being done actively. The so-called public organizations on the territory of the EU, and also information operations and disinformation of different types. Now I'd like to give the floor to my colleague who will tell about that in more detail. Yeah, thank you very much. I will approach that from the other side to what Valeria has mentioned about manipulations and the challenges that are there before not just the potential summit of peace, which is incredibly important, but in context of modern negotiations, of course, it's combating Russian manipulations, because I think that the topic of manipulations will be significantly considered today, but Mr. Denisenko, well-known expert, it's his topic, so I will not talk a lot about that. I will just say that with our experts during this analytical research, indeed, we have highlighted the fact that manipulation and in general Russian interpretation of war and the beginning of war reasons and consequences, so to say, is an inevitable part of Russian negotiation strategy and in general its construction. And together with experts, we highlight in the following criteria regarding the mechanisms of prevention of these Russian manipulations. According to this, we can say that indeed we could not try to warn international community about possible Russian provocations, including informational, political, economic, etc., engage other countries such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, and others in order to stabilize the energy market. Well, of course, in order to strengthen the relationship and cooperation with countries beyond NATO, it sounds not easy, but together with experts, we came to the point that these are quite good opportunities, well, of course, to limit the impact of Russian media and disinformation via joint coordination with our partners. Well, currently Ukraine is working powerfully in this sense, and we have already signed a lot of documents regarding such cooperation. However, we need to continue this track because unfortunately and currently further on there are a lot of problems related to dissemination of Russian disinformation in the media space of many countries, and Ukraine has to work more powerfully in terms of prevention. Well, of course, we have to strengthen the diplomacy both with Ukrainian allies and also with the countries that are not participating as actively in order to be able to analyze and research the policies of these countries in order to find some fields for cooperation. In general, using the thesis of one of our speakers, it is worth mentioning that these manipulations and approaches Russia is already using in modern negotiations. It was both in context of negotiations between USA and Russia and also on the Turkish track. And unfortunately, that has impacted negatively the beginning of this bilateral communication on the position of Ukraine, and currently has changed the declared approach to fair peace. When we continue to analyze this topic, especially in the context of Summit of Peace and negotiation positions, our experts came to the point that they identified certain problems that might arise either before the summit or during negotiations. Well, actually, in general, indeed, they were confirmed before the results of our research were already conducted. It could have been seen during the primary negotiations between Washington and Moscow and at the beginning of negotiations in Turkey. So experts came to the point that indeed the problems that will emerge and that are emerging currently as for the Summit of Peace, it's now there is still no date when it will be conducted, and there is no strategic vision of development of summit. And also the beginning of the dialogue between the USA and Russia has impacted that significantly. It created new threats and challenges, not just for Ukraine, but also for international community. Also, Washington's approach, it has changed the approach to diplomatic formats in general. However, as I am mentioning about the American topic and British and European partners as of today, our speakers will tell about that in more detail. Well, indeed, another challenge is indifference of countries like Global South, Latin America, Asia, because they are still not informed enough about the war of Russia against Ukraine, then lack of strategic planning, of support. Yes, we are so grateful to our international partners. However, most resources still remain chaotic and without the powerful long-term logistics. Well, of course, in this regard, we can also say that it is lack of a real wish of Russia to end this war in spite of their interests. It was underlined on many negotiations in this context, and that is negotiation initiative of the USA as alternative to multilateral summit, and we will tell about that a bit more later on, analyzing risks, results, and consequences for international community. Because actually, in general, we can say that this dialogue that was founded, it came into the phase of we are cardinally reviewing our approach, and the summit that has to collect the huge number of international community, number of representatives of international community, and is based on Ukrainian formula of peace. Well, currently we can see the priority, which is switching into more closed format to less number of participants, not the bilateral already, but still it looks like negotiations of big states. In addition, such formats, they might undermine the transparency of the process, unfortunately lower the trust to results from the side of international partners, and create opportunities for Russia from certain couloir agreements, which will not coincide for sure with the principles of justice and peace for Ukraine. So using the practices of closed negotiation formats or platforms, it will give Russia opportunity for certain maneuvers in order to strengthen their interest occupation of Ukrainian territories. Well, and that will give them the opportunity to play the card. I mean, freezing the conflict and creating precedent in international law. Also, coming back to the key challenges and formats of negotiations between the USA and Russian Federation that we've considered, we can say that our experts highlighting the following challenges, and I think that we see them already because the research has started in October 2024, and I think my colleagues mentioned that already, and it was about the summit, and it was reformulated. So we are considering this context. Therefore, I'd like to repeat myself. As for the challenges that were there at the moment, experts have highlighted the participation of Ukraine as a country in war and as the party of the conflict that has to be one of the key participants of the process. As for the Summit of Peace, for very close and limited negotiation formats, of course, it's ignoring the role of the EU as the guarantee of international safety and legitimization of Russia as full member of negotiation process. As for the main risks of this format of negotiations, it could have led to freezing the conflict without real peace for Ukraine and the occupation of territories, and also that Russia will not be held liable. It is also certain geopolitical fragmentation of the EU if other European countries can start some negotiations with the Russian side in order to achieve their own interests. Of course, the possibility to weaken Ukraine on international arena, in addition, beginning at the moment of negotiations between USA and Russia, it is impacting, like conducting second summit of peace. But in this regard, we can also say that it has increased the role of Europe in this process. Also, experts, especially Americanists, have highlighted that USA is losing the status of the guarantee of European safety and that the world is dividing into the fields of impact. And at the moment, the bilateral dialogue between Russia and the USA could have led to such risk as exclusion of Ukraine from negotiation process, reducing the role of Ukraine and also creating the precedent for other conflicts, strengthening the positions of Russia. And in general, consider such option as possibility of conducting and creating some other negotiation positions or platforms that can create also opportunities for Russia to legitimize its positions. So in general, our experts came to the opinion that at the moment, the dialogue between Washington and Moscow actually was not kind of made Russia a full member of negotiation process. So taking a look at this situation and taking a look at all the threats and challenges and the problems created by Russia during negotiation process regarding the end of war of Russia against Ukraine, we have come to a range of conclusions that could have been useful. They might be useful for the second summit, like before the second summit, and also in different negotiation formats. So in general, we can say that our experts came to the conclusion that in spite of many changes in international arena regarding negotiation processes, still summit remains potentially acting multilateral format. It requires certain reformatting in the context of achieving justice, peace for Ukraine and building new architecture of European safety. Well, actually, the key arguments that we can highlight in is keeping international attention. It is really needed because when we are talking about other global threats and wars in the region, well, they require active actions from Ukrainian side in order to preserve attention to the things that are happening in Ukraine, as well as, in general, paying attention from the coalition that is to expand their support and their awareness in this. Of course, to formulate the agenda, taking into account Ukrainian interests, that is without any compromises. I mean, without the compromise of ending Russian-Ukrainian war on any conditions, but no, just Ukrainian side and partners have to underline the criteria, have to have clear criteria for justful peace, and to have the support from international community regarding territorial wholeness, and also bring Russia to liability. And also it has to be the signal for other countries what are the consequences for aggression and crimes. And such format has to evidence that the world community will not be okay if other countries are grasping the territories of independent countries and they respect international law. And of course, for further work, for strengthening the negotiations and in multilateral formats, our experts have developed the range of recommendations. So they might be useful not just before the summit, but also taking into account the modern stages of negotiation processes. to make mobilization of support and end of war on right conditions. However, we need to have the clear position together with our allies, of course, with the EU as well. So we have to be based on not the compromises, but end of war and return of Ukrainian territories and clear safety guarantees. As for the summit, it has to be the updated approach to how it is held, and also the opinion of experts regarding the formula of peace. It all has to be integrated into European and global initiatives on safety. Well, and of course, it has to be adjusted to modern geopolitical conditions. Well, and strengthening the work with the allies to develop some safety guarantees and safety alliances, in addition to synchronize the positions of Ukraine and countries, members, regarding negotiations with Russia, to understand that any interaction with Russia has to happen only after Russia shows that they are eager to end this aggression. And of course, we need to detect and prevent Russian manipulations, in addition, information and military provocations that might be there. And of course, expanding the range of participants with the possibility of engaging the countries of Global South, and also countries that have some leverages of impact to Russia. And preliminarily, we have to work with such countries on the mechanisms. Of course, we need to find out the mechanism to stop such manipulations in the future and to prepare the long-term plan of Ukrainian recovery that will include safety guarantees that will also become the basics for further international support of Ukraine after war. Thank you so much, Bogdana and Valeria. It was so interesting, and actually you mentioned the key moments. And from my side, I just wanted to mention literally like 1 minute. If we are talking about Russian propaganda, then it is very important that we ourselves are proactive. I mean, Ukraine and partners, we have to formulate our narratives, because if we are talking about some fakes, manipulations, we are spending quite a lot of resources on that, and we can just spend this on some other issues. Yeah, many important moments were mentioned regarding the threat, regarding the new American administration, and we invite to the two speakers who will join us online. That is Taras Zhovtenko, expert on safety issues, executive director of Democratic Initiatives Fund named after Ilko Kucherev. Taras, hi. And Philippe Lefebvre. He is associate at the Center for Britain and Europe. Hello, Philip. So, what we'd like to talk about with you. The first question is to Taras. Taras, how do you think, what is the vision of European Union regarding negotiations in Russian-Ukrainian war as of now? Hi, one more time. Hi, Yehor. Hi, all the participants. Thank you, first of all, for the possibility to participate in this discussion, and also for the opinions that were mentioned already, because they are really good. And thank you very much, Yehor, for your question, because we do understand that from the position of European Union, taking into account the global context, taking into account Russian and American negotiation track that has started, taking into account, let us say so, the specifics of transformation and the vision of peaceful regulation by the President Donald Trump. Well, I would like to divide the position of leaders of the coalition of those who are willing, like France, Great Britain, and Germany. Well, we understand that institutionally and politically, European Union, well, let us say so, is not really ready to be the consolidated player in the peaceful regulation process, negotiation process regarding the end of Russian and Ukrainian war. And at the end, we have to understand that the leaders of this coalition, the leaders of, I would say, like the updated Europe, that is Britain, France, and Federative Republic of Germany, well, all these countries, they are the key locomotive on promoting European vision primarily and ending Russian-Ukrainian war, and also guarantees of safety for Ukraine and also safety for Europe in general. Yeah, Ihor mentioned that correctly at the beginning, that European countries had the risk of remaining the odd one out, when this Russian-American track of negotiations has started. But quite quickly we realized that this formula of peace and Ukrainian-Russian war that Donald Trump sees, it can't take into account the position of Europe. I think that colleagues will talk about that further on in more detail about the offer of Washington and the White House, but in one thesis, I will try to say that it's just the end of hostilities. I mean, the ceasefire mode. And then Trump is not really worried about anything else. He wants to give that away to Europe. It has to be European responsibility as for the guarantee of peace and ensuring European safety. Well, actually, the most significant role is for the European countries in terms of protecting themselves from Russian threat in the Ukrainian direction and in general. At the beginning of negotiations between Moscow and Washington was kind of a threat. There was a threat that Europe might fall out of the process, so to say. But again, Donald Trump and the leaders of coalition, they realized, and he himself realized, that without negotiations with the Europeans, at least in terms of the format, how the practical guarantees of safety will be provided to Ukraine, and what is the role of the USA in general in this process strategically. So it's almost impossible to implement the formula of peace of Trump. And, well, accordingly, what are his ideas when he continues communication with the Russian side? So the position of the coalition, of those who are willing, it is sounding similar to Ukrainian position. And, of course, Ukraine was more active position in terms of war and technical conditions of, again, suspending hostilities on the territory of Ukraine and future guarantees of safety for Ukraine, that Russia will not continue the hostilities or some attacks after a ceasefire agreement. So actually it allowed Trump to understand that actually he has to take Europe into account, and actually the issue of safety guarantees for Ukraine and the anti-Russian sanctions between Brussels and Washington, these are the key fundamental, in my opinion, even basics of what role of Europe and Ukraine should be like in ending Russian-Ukrainian war. So the USA realized that without Europe and without active participation of Europeans achieving sustainable peace and guarantee, it's impossible to guarantee safety for Ukraine. And the coalition is giving the tone here to this strategic negotiation process. Well, because we were witnesses of the sessions when leaders of the coalition came to Kyiv together with President Zelensky, and they were calling to President Trump, and by phone they were approving some strategic issues. And actually this position of the coalition of leaders, it might become very important, because we understand that in the European Union there are certain countries that have quite specific position regarding the fact of continuing military support to Ukraine, as well as initiatives of European Union and the vision of European safety by European Union in general, etc., etc. And here the European Union primarily as the subject of regional global subject. There is issue of transformation. not just strategic priorities, but also rebuilding their own safety position and participation in European safety, but also transformation of certain internal mechanisms of decision making and reacting to challenges and threats that directly work with the EU. And European Union can already rely on military and technical base that was developed by the coalition. And also we talk about the position of leaders of Europe, the position of Britain, France, Germany, position of the USA. Because as of today, the main problem, the main pause, so to say, of the United States of Europe to regulate the war, it's in participation of the United States of America in this process. So we clearly understand Trump's position. He says, like, no American troops or American weapons should not participate directly in guarantees of safety for Ukraine. But the coalition is trying to, let us say so, keep the USA on board and ensure strategically efficiency that might be in the territory of Ukraine, and also from the side of the United States of America. It has to look like certain results to ensure the objective monitoring of situation and stick to the ceasefire mode. From the American side, if this is the ceasefire mode that is violated from the side of Russia, then, allies are asking to cover them from the air, and American side has to react also to this violation of ceasefire mode. However, as far as nowadays, Trump is kind of delaying that in time in order to give answers to Europeans. In this regard, we see that the coalition is moving forward, and actually there are certain agreements already, some fundamental and main points to develop the nuclear strategy, European nuclear strategy, that is a cooperation of France and Great Britain and Germany as well, that, maybe the weapons can be on the territory of Germany, etc. In parallel, maybe with some other weapons. And the agreement between these three leaders of modern Europe is very important in terms of conventional strategy, conventional stop of Russian Federation, because there are all the signs of that Kremlin is planning to expand the armed conflict on the territory of Ukraine and partially have that on certain elements of the eastern part of NATO. And, the European Union position now has to be based on the results, practical results that the coalition already has, and at the end it is organically combined, because 2 out of 3 leaders of coalition, they are the countries leaders of European Union, and actually the question of transformation of safety policies will depend on the practical implementation of the mechanisms that the coalition of willing has already processed, and the agreements that were there in the last several weeks between NATO and Ukraine about selling American weapons to Europeans. And the 2 key focuses are there. Part of weapons go to weaponize Ukraine and support it, and part of procurement of American weapons will be in European warehouses, and that will support, again, European safety, and it will be the basics for safety and strategic policy of European Union. Thank you. Thank you very much, Taras.
Philip, so we've seen that the UK became more united and close to the European Union, and cabinet of Keir Starmer, which began its work a year ago. Starmer held European political community summit last year, and what do you think about the coordination between the EU and UK in this new negotiation reality, and are the EU and the UK capable of being independent from Washington in these negotiations? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Real pleasure to be here. Hope you can all hear me well. The UK has, of course, taken quite a central role in the negotiations, especially since the election of Donald Trump, and trying to be sort of the main European voice in the picture. Let's not forget, after the disastrous sort of White House meeting between Zelensky and Trump, it was Keir Starmer who was the first leader to call back, but also the Germans equally, especially under Friedrich Merz, have raised this. I think what the UK pushes at the negotiation table better than any other European ally, and that does differentiate it to most European allies, is the need to provide more strength to Ukraine, and that the most successful negotiating tactic is to prove that Ukraine is still in the fight, that Ukraine can still push back offensives, and that is clearly, when it comes to the positions of strength that Russian delegations show, has been effective and continues to be effective. So in that sense, I think that's the UK's main push and relationship with the EU, is keeping that on the table. Even when it comes to sanctions, the EU might sign themselves, the UK is still pushing for more, is pushing for more on the industrial side as well, and that's sort of its approach to it. I do think that the relationship between the EU and UK has been shaped very much by these negotiations and by Ukrainian relations with the UK and EU, although I would use EU in this context to reference the member states themselves, because this is still one of the areas where collectively there's very little that the European Union is finding as effective in negotiations, and it's the bilateral agreements and negotiations and working between the countries that is most effective and the UK is engaged with. I think what I also want to highlight is, when we look at the most effective groupings, I think it's still the Ramstein group. It's still the Ukraine contact group, which, although of course the US has sort of withdrawn its leadership of, both the UK and Germany now lead this. And when you connect it to new NATO initiatives to support weapons in Ukraine, just that ability to bring 50 countries together behind Ukraine, ostensibly for the continuing of the defense of Ukraine, has been the most effective sort of coordination of negotiations in that sense, as well as, of course, directly supporting Ukraine itself. Equally, when we see the internal struggles of the EU and NATO, for that matter, provide a unified voice when it comes to Ukraine, the UK has done quite a lot to make sure there are other mechanisms of supporting Ukraine and for keeping that on the agenda and keeping the activity afloat. I do fear that the negotiations over Ukrainian membership to both the EU and NATO are stalling and will continue to stall, mostly based on internal political routes, and that sort of allows the UK to have a stronger position because it's central to NATO and it's outside the EU, unfortunately. But that does mean that the relationship between it and Ukraine can be strengthened in ways that it cannot with some EU member states, where the discussion of membership is implicit in that relationship. What I would be pushing for at this stage, though, to support further, is that more countries do consider envoys to Ukraine, Ukrainian peace, Ukrainian reconstruction. Italy, of course, has its minister, has its envoy for reconstruction. The UK has its ambassadors, and of course most countries have their ambassadors, but much like the way the US is providing its own thought leadership, even though we might critique what that thoughts are itself, I do think that what the UK and EU can do better is to provide their own envoys with more sort of power and negotiation mandates to support Ukraine in this. Ultimately, you mentioned the question being, can the UK and EU sort of do something without the US? No, because it is ultimately that deciding factor of the White House that says whether a ceasefire and any further negotiations are legitimized in some ways. Not even necessarily that the United States would be an implementing factor to it, though of course it famously in, say, Bosnia was the implementing factor through the NATO mission there. but more that it is the voice that others would listen to in a way that the UK and EU are sort of more compromised on the side of Ukraine. And it's unfortunate the United States sees themselves as a voice that's not necessarily entirely with Ukraine, and it's sort of in between Ukraine and Russia. And what that does mean is that at least when it does legitimize statements, legitimize movements and actions from Ukraine, the UK and EU, that does allow for more purchase. And the last thing I want to say with some of this is the role of actors outside the EU, UK or US. You know, I do believe that there's a lot to say about the stabilizing actions and the effects, for example, of negotiations in the Middle East, which we use sort of third parties. Same with the major relations that Ukraine's been developing with countries in Africa and South America. You know, I think all the BRICS nations, obviously outside Russia, you know, are definitely interesting partners to this. And what I therefore wonder is if the UK and EU allies can do better to get those countries also on this side, on these negotiating trails. There's a lot of the world to cover, and these ceasefires, I think as you mentioned earlier in the report, you know, Russian narratives on Ukraine have spread far, far, far and wide. And we also need countering, not just in the sort of citizenry understanding of this war, of this Russian aggression, but also in the government understanding of their roles in these negotiations. So with that, I'll leave for now, but thank you very much. Thank you for the question and looking forward to further discussions.
Дякую.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Thank you, Taras.
You know, it's time to reread and revisit the history of the Crimean War, just to understand how Russia could be defeated. Дякую за ваші.
Thank you very much for your comments, and I would like to invite to the floor Janusz Hryщенko, advisor of Department of Southern Caucasus and Turkey, Second Territorial Department, MFA of Ukraine. And with Mr. Janusz, we are going to talk about actually the position of Turkey. My first question is, how do you see the role of Turkey in negotiations between Russia and Ukraine? Hi, everyone. Well, I need to start with the fact, in my opinion, we all know that Turkey sticks to traditional policy of balance in the region, Black Sea region, and this traditionality is also impacting the external policy of Ankara. As for the role of Turkey in negotiations, that is actually what you asked. In this case, we are incredibly grateful to the Turkish side for such platform that they allow us to use on their territory for the negotiation process. And you know that traditionally Turkey is supporting territorial sovereignty of Ukraine. Starting from 2014, Turkey, in the framework of international organizations and primarily the UN, is voting and is the co-author of Ukrainian resolutions regarding territorial wholeness and sovereignty. It's incredibly important support. Moreover, Turkey is a strategic partner of Ukraine, and we develop cooperation with them. And it is developing in the practical field in many directions, and one of them, most important in given time, is military technical cooperation, where there are significant results. And I think that in the future we will be able to see even more. As for some elements, some positions that might impact, well, now quite often we have such questions as whether Turkey is neutral, and taking into account how the development of bilateral relationship is happening with Ukraine and Russia. We need to take into account that, and again, in my opinion, that is a process. Even for Turkey, it's not the easy process, and it requires a lot of efforts in order to take into account the situation that nowadays is there due to war. We have to keep this balance in relationship with both parties, and we have to come to certain agreements and constructive agreements, both with Moscow and Kyiv. So we have to give you attention to this fact. Using one of the main topics of these negotiations in Turkey that happened this year, 3 times already, it was the exchange of military captives, and we could see that this is the main topic that is discussed and where we have certain results. Altogether with that, still, there is no, I am sorry, maybe I will not mention that, but like the patronage country that will help us with returning civilian captives. And maybe that will be Turkey or not, but how now MFA sees the fact that Turkey can become the country, kind of the country that will conduct this patronage. As for the bilateral cooperation with the Turkish side, directly, sure, from the other side, it's humanitarian movement. It's also the movement in humanitarian issues and exchange of military detainees, returning children, etc., etc. So in any case, there is certain positive dynamics. And it's already a big achievement. And the fact that Turkey is supporting us in this process, it is already the basis for that potentially we might have positive development when going to more, let us say so, political level of certain discussions that potentially might happen in the framework of a negotiation process. I'm not saying that it's Istanbul, but I am talking in general if we imagine the negotiation process. From the other side, well, we have to understand that just like every other country, Turkey has own national interests, just like we do. And in this case, Turkey will follow their plans. These are long-term strategic interests of the country that is trying to become regional leader. Therefore, of course, Turkish side is, in its activity, in its position, is starting from this aspect. In your opinion, how can Turkey impact a Russian position? Well, here, it's quite an interesting question. And from the other side, I think that maybe we should kind of change the format. How can we impact? And, well, maybe to promote our own interest in the framework of this topic. And here, we have development of bilateral relationship with Turkey on the first place in different fields that helps to both like strengthen and promote various topics in different spheres. So accordingly, this aspect has such impact that can be in the framework of tactic and strategic interests of Ukraine and Turkey. Yeah, that will unite the two parties even more. Another question. Next year, a NATO summit will happen in Turkey, and how do you think, how can the position of Turkey impact our Euro-Atlantic integration as well as the position regarding the end of Ukrainian-Russian war? Well, in this case, Turkey is the country that is of high interest for Euro-Atlantic Alliance, and this is the country which geographically and in military sense is one of the most powerful ones in NATO framework. So people try to listen to the position of Turkey, especially taking into account geopolitical changes that we are witnessing in the world and interaction of Turkey and European Union and the attempt to go to development of constructive dialogue and development of safety interaction and going to more pragmatic economic projects. Well, it tells us that actually the position of Turkey will be heard. Yeah, it's small prognosis. Okay, we invite the following speaker. Yeah, you can stay with us and we will make brief discussion. Okay, so we would like to invite to the floor Alexander Kraev, Director of Program Northern America in the Council of Foreign Policy, Ukrainian Prism. Hi, Alexander. And we will talk about the USA. Yeah, how do you see the vision, the administration of Trump and their roles in these negotiations about Russian-Ukrainian war? Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, dear colleagues. Greetings to all of you. I think I should start with the fact that we don't observe strategy as such. So Yehor has formulated it properly. It's vision. What is strategy in general? I am sorry, but it's certain teaching professional deformation. We will start with the definition. What is strategy? Yes, strategy is not just availability of the desire to achieve something in long-term prospect, but it's understanding what steps you have to do in order to come to this point in time and space, and understanding how complex it all is and how it should function. It's not like I want everyone to be afraid of America, to respect and love America in 5 years. But we need to do some steps that are united in one system, and this system is very important. So the strategy, with the rare historical exclusions, is unpredictable. We had Nixon, big and powerful, and he has developed the theory that all your strategy should be that nobody knows what your strategy is. But it's very hard to compare Nixon's administration and current administration, because Nixon's administration, in spite of all the problems and the Watergate at the end, which led to its ruination, has worked with more complicated issues. The Vietnam War, Cold War in the acute phase, and, well, they managed that quite stably. And, current administration, they have vision but no strategy. And yeah, the vision is it has to be ended as soon as possible, and Trump has to be praised for that. So unfortunately, here we have to say that in addition to no strategy, point number one, point number two, it's hard for us to approach current situation in normative sense, institutionally. With the normal situation, with a normal administration for other country, I would have told that the position of the president branch is like this, and the Ministry of Defense like this, etc., etc., etc. It is comparable in certain points, but we have the differences that has to be resolved. Here, normative part is almost absent. We see the State Department, which continues having its own position, but they are not always ready to express that because of the position of Rubio. And we see Pentagon because before the decision of Trump to suspend support to other states, they want to show themselves to Trump from the good side. And we see Trump and all the interest is focused on him, and all this so-called vision is focused on him. If we analyze the content, I mean step by step, everything that Trump says, writes, and says during public speeches, we can either drive crazy step by step, or we can just start speaking like him. I'm the person who's working on that for 6 years. What we can rely on is certain consequences of decisions, certain actions, and very often Trump has those kind of separate from words. What do we see from this administration? First of all, we could see the constant search of the way of least resistance. When Ukraine was demanding as much as possible, when Ukraine was demanding some engagement, troops, weapons, etc., etc., Trump's administration said, okay, Ukraine is a very difficult partner. I'm calling Putin. Putin says everything is okay. And we saw calls to Putin, and there were 6 calls already. We saw the contact on the level of advisors in terms of national safety, and we could see Trump, who was saying very weird things that, well, I see Russia's ready for negotiations, and it's hard with Ukraine. However, at the moment when Trump started seeing that negotiations with Putin don't give him this macho style, and that he cannot achieve peace. He has like 10, then 17 patriots, and then the format of negotiation with Ukraine. Yeah, it might work actually, at least. And this is the least thing. Trump is being praised, and they say like, "Oh, Mr. President, you are making such nice and great steps, and the direction you move in is so correct. And Europeans are doing the things that Trump wants. So Europeans are giving more weapons. They're ready to pay for that, and all because Trump started paying more attention to Ukraine." So Trump actually in this situation, and even now in the scandal with Jeffrey Epstein, and also in his issues with migrants and inflation issues, actually Trump of this second term follows very simple logic. He is using the way of the least resistance. So if you can amid the problems, then you're doing that. If not, then as he told to Republicans, if they ask about Einstein, just say directly that actually Obama has to go to court, and that's it. He says like turn off the cameras, and that's it. If you can't solve the problem, then just don't. That's it. We forget. We can't just put Obama to jail. We can talk about migrants who are eating cats and dogs. Can't resolve the issue of Ukraine. Okay, we give 50 days for negotiations, give weapons. And what happens after 50 days is the problem of tomorrow. We will see how the situation will develop. And we can say, like, what is the vision of this administration until this can be kind of taken off your shoulders, then do it. If you are praised for something, do the things you are praised for. And every action has to be aimed at that at the end of this presidential term, Mr. Trump either has the Nobel Prize for Peace or a well-written book or the memorial somewhere, not just in the Snensky region of in Kyiv, but I think that the resolution was not established because one of the deputies wanted to have the memorial for Trump. So where we can win, we will win. Where not, we will forget about that. Okay, in this half a year, we could see that Washington and Moscow were kind of coming closer to each other, and it came to the moment that on the website of State Department there was congratulation with the Day of Russia in June. In your opinion, what are the risks of this Russian-American kind of coming closer to each other for Ukraine and for Europe in general? Well, the main risk is that it hasn't ended yet. In spite of the fact that they are giving Patriots rockets to Ukraine support, and Americans are talking better about us, in informational space, etc., the main quality of this administration is that they were right. It's not always bad because, being chaotic, like this chaotic behavior of Mr. Trump, it is threatening Russia, just like Ukraine, and for China as well as for Europeans. Well, he is unpredictable for everyone, not just like good guys or bad guys. So this is part of the threat, actually, because earlier he was praising Russia, and you said a very good thing, like very weird case, like congratulations of Russia with the Day of Russia. But the fact that it doesn't exist now, it doesn't mean that we won't come back to that. In the moment, well, we all perfectly know that. I think colleagues will confirm. Russians can play narratives. They don't tell all the information. They can lie. They especially can pretend for other partners that they are open for negotiations, etc., if Russians succeed in that. Again, unfortunately, we are working with experienced and sly diplomats from that side. If they can take Trump to their side, we will see that. But what will be the results? We saw that during NATO summit, when all the program was shortened to 1.5 hour quick meeting because Trump might be bored, tired, there's no weapons, and Europeans figure it out on your own. And Ukraine, here I'm jumping to 2023, the moment when we were only preparing for the campaign, and Trump was saying that the Ukraine is shit, whole crap country, just like Afghanistan. I am quoting, that you should not work with Ukraine. And then March 2024, what do we do with the war that is happening like thousands of miles from our borders? So in spite of all the positive that we have as of now, it's the case when we have to be ready that at any moment, efforts of Russian diplomacy, lies, or just lack of patience from Trump's side, we may return to the idea when we have to explain very simple things, and we have to say that Mr. Trump, it's Russian aggression, they are the aggressor state, we are the state that is kind of victimized, etc. And it's just like in table games. When you throw the dice and moving on the map, you always risk it going to the start. So, yeah, when everybody goes to finish, you might return to the very beginning. Thank you very much, Alexander. Vadim Denisenko, chef-editor Dilova Stolitsa, doctor of historical sciences, journalist, politologist, and I like to talk about Russian invasion with him. From my side, I would like to add about this, like USA and Russia, that Russia hybrid impact, USA, it exists for a long time, and that is why now we have to understand better how Russian hybrid war works, and we have to explain that to our partners. So, Vadim, how do you think, what is the main goal of Putin right now, taking into account these 50 days announced by Trump, and what can we expect from Russia now? Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation, and answering the question, I have to divide that into two parts. Yes, so yeah, two parts answer. First, why Putin doesn't want and cannot, in my opinion, stop the war. The thing is that when we are talking about Putin's motives, we have to understand several extremely important things, and not many people are talking about that. Part of that is not mentioned that often. First, psychological or psychiatric factor, no matter how we call it. Well, actually, he is sick with attacking Ukraine, kind of destroying Ukraine, etc., etc. I won't stop on that because it's a well-known thing. Second moment, people are not talking about that as much. It's the structure of society as of today, Russian society. Russian society, according to our studies, that was a study made by Analytical Center at Dilova Stolitsa together with Mish Group. Sociological company consists of three big parts.
5% росіян приблизно.
First, it's 63% people who want to end the war today. And victory of Russia for them is that Ukraine will not join NATO and that the front line will stop on this place. That is the victory for them. Second part is the strength of the Russian regime. 25% of hooray patriots for whom the victory in war is destroying Ukraine. And the problem is that this part, this hooray patriotic part, but in addition, proactive, smaller part is basics for the regime, Putin's regime. How to explain to this part of society that the war is suspended on the front line, or, for example, some other conditions even beneficial for Russia offered by Trump several months ago? Internal bloc of Kremlin doesn't understand how to do that. What to do with these people? Again, they don't understand what to do with them, and they understand that perfectly well in spite of, they make a lot of researches of society. We are not doing that, for example, like in-depth researches in Ukraine. They understand that most of these people will turn into hooray patriotic opposition to Vladimir Putin in the moment when they stop war. And actually how this opposition will behave, and taking into account the million of people who will come back from the front line that are in Russian army in this or other way, internal bloc of Kremlin, they don't understand what to do with them. So what do they do now? They are trying to do certain kind of, to clear up things in some communities. These are first attempts of trying to do something with that. They are trying to make the first programs, how veterans of war will behave after the end of this war. They are trying to look for different positions for them, starting from the service of some punishments and ending up with the police and some smaller authorities. But the question is what to do with this part of society. Putin has no answer to that, and internal bloc of Kremlin has no answer to that yet. So when we are talking about the end of war, about negotiation position, we have to remember about these 25% of Russian population that Russian authorities are focused on, and they are relying on them and what to do with them when post-war period of Ukraine remains as if Ukraine remains as a state. So Kremlin doesn't understand what to do with that. Second part of the answer, what are they doing right now? The strategy of Putin from the first days of Trump's presidency it was in two moments. First, not to fight with Trump, and second, to have the delay in time as much as possible. Well, the maximum program is to gain the maximum benefits, but the minimum program is to have some delays in time and delays in process. What we see right now is a continuation of this strategy, and I think it will not change. Everything we saw yesterday and the day before in Istanbul, it's actually the attempt to turn the Istanbul process into second Minsk process. Even with formal sense, we can see full copy-paste, because even yesterday they offered to create the groups that are identical to the groups in Minsk process. And I would like to remind everyone that back then there was humanitarian group that was kind of working, at least, and other groups that were just for decorations. So now Putin will do the same, and I will repeat myself. His main task is to delay time as much as possible in order to postpone the moment when Trump will introduce some more or less serious sanctions. Why is that important? I will end my speech on that, not to speak for too long. Russian economy, with the analogy to all the previous sanction packages, they show that in 4 months, maximum 4 months, they are adjusting to any newly introduced sanctions. They are building new logistics and financial chains. Well, actually, so to say, the situation in Russian economy is very complicated as of now. It is not critical, and the economy of Russia is not falling to parts, but it's very complicated. And Vladimir Putin doesn't need these months of turbulence. And the only thing he wants to do is to postpone the moment when they will have this turbulence. 3rd of September, there will be military parade in Beijing. And Trump and Putin are invited, and maybe there the meeting of 3 leaders will happen. An important moment, 3rd of September, is officially written both in Russia and China as the day of ending the World War, Second World War, but 2nd September 1945, Japan capitulated. So how do you think, what can be expected from this meeting in Beijing, and what might happen afterwards? Well, first of all, I'm not sure that this meeting will happen, because as of now the probability is quite low. Why? Because as of now it is hard to imagine that Trump will go to Beijing as a status. He has to go there only if some kind of either important bilateral agreements of China and USA will be signed, or at least 30-day ceasefire that Putin will agree to. So these are the 2 reasons why Trump might go to Beijing. The probability as of now that the situation will develop according to this scenario is quite low. So I think that we have a big question mark under the question, like whether Trump will go there or not. However, the key negotiations for ending our war is negotiation of USA and China, and I think that maybe as part of the negotiations, or maybe not as part of continued negotiations, it's EU and China negotiations. And from my point of view, Trump, as of now, has those leverages of impact that will allow, in a clear perspective for us, it's clear, like it's 1 year, force Putin stop war without support of China. So in my opinion, it's incredibly important for us to understand what is happening right now, how the negotiations of China and the USA are happening, and EU and China as well, because EU is trying to play their game in this story. And the second moment, from my point of view, without big agreements, China, USA, the probability of ending the war is low. Thank you. Thank you. Tell us, please, do we have any questions from the audience to our speakers? Okay, yeah, sure. Please present yourself. Andrei Makarenko, Embassy of Germany. Brief question. I think none of the speakers has mentioned Ramstein format. Did we bury that already, or there is some prospects of that platform for coordination of actions? Just briefly, your assessment. I think, Alexander, it's a question to you. Yeah, thank you so much for your question. In the format how Ramstein was planned, unfortunately now it's not possible because, as a matter of fact, if we simplify Ramstein procedure, what was it for several years? Americans were coming, they were giving the basic main package of the most rare equipment and needed equipment. Those were patriots at the beginning, Europeans and our allies were covering some other needs that had to be covered during the project. Americans are not ready to come and give the biggest piece of meat for this. But the Ramstein format can function further on, but the format was primarily made a certain vertical, that there is a certain percentage that is giving the main mass of that and others are just adding to that. If procedures of this summit will be reviewed and somebody comes out of the initiative like, okay, let us do that more in a collegial way, and just like in NATO, every country is specialized in certain type of weapons and certain number, etc., so let us write that here, how that will function in Ramstein format. If this initiative will appear, Ramstein work will continue existing. And second part, hopefully that will continue existing in certain way that in the framework of Ramstein, starting from the 12th meeting, please tell me if I'm wrong, in parallel there were meetings of big executive directors of defense institutions. So there were people who were talking about industry, about money, and how this all political blah 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 can be performed in reality, like big French producers, British producers, German producers. And in my opinion, every time when the framework of the format they had such meeting, we were talking about successful meeting. And by the way, Rheinmetall and other German producers, they had quite good leadership in there because they were conducting the business format. So I think these are the two ways how we can say the Ramstein format, how we can strengthen that. Step aside from one key moment, and second, going via big businesses, because I can say that from my American point of view, again, what I'm communicating with and what I'm researching, there are American companies interested in investments into this direction and investments into Ukraine, into our capacities, our possibilities. In my opinion, that's wonderful beginning of, yeah. Thank you very much. Any other questions? Yeah. Irina Bahinska, Donetsk National University. Well, actually, a lot of important issues were discussed today, and till the very last speaker, well, I think I'm about the last words. But you mentioned a lot about the limitations. Sometimes the limitations that we can do nothing with, in order to create the real negotiation process or a negotiation track even that will be developed in parallel with military actions. And here were some questions that modern Istanbul negotiations are similar to Minsk format, even though we know that there is institutional memory in conflict. We cannot organize negotiations from the scratch every time if somebody wants to. Always, even if there is some new negotiation content of delegation, they will take into account everything that had been done by previous authorities. So, at the example of Istanbul negotiations, we see that, Kislitsa was there, but the content of the Ukrainian negotiation group is more saying that they were going to talk about ceasefire, but even there we did not succeed. How do you see it? What are some negotiation formats possible at all in present moment, and who can be the main participants of this negotiation format? I think that with the participation of international intermediaries, because bilateral format as of now does not work. Thank you. First of all, I disagree that MFA is not present in Istanbul format, because you mentioned that there's Kislitsa, at least, right? So saying that MFA is not there, it sounds weird. But the level, when as of now the head of delegation, like we have very high level of Ukrainian delegation. I started my speech from the fact that as of today, Vladimir Putin is making everything possible from his side in order not to start the negotiation processes. Therefore, when one of the parties refuses to have negotiations, it's very hard to have these negotiations. I will repeat myself that as of now, unfortunately, the United States of America and Donald Trump in person, they have limited tools in order to force Putin to go to the negotiation table to have this ceasefire for 30 days. That is why I am saying that from my point of view, nowadays it's very important how the negotiations will develop or won't develop between China and the USA, where, yeah, if we are talking economic point of view, then China is the last hope for Russian Federation. All the leverages of impact that exists as of today to Russian Federation, they are focused in China because 50% of Russian oil, it's like 50% of Russian gold and 25% of platinum, and some seafood, more than 50% of foods, etc., etc., etc. And in addition to that, these are opportunities, of course, we are intermediaries, but still to procure the technological things necessary for production of weapons and manufacturing weapons. So, yeah, hoping that 50 days will pass by and kind of Trump will force Russia to do something, well, it looks kind of unreal a bit. Yeah, Mr. Janos, thank you. I'd like to add, indeed, the level of first deputy of the Minister of Foreign Affairs is high level of representation. And if you saw the list of participants from Ukrainian delegation, then actually everybody is there on identical positions, just from different institutions and departments. So at present, saying that MFA is not presented there, it is incorrect. From the other side, as you are saying, whether the issue of ceasefire was planned and achieving some agreements and the third meeting or not, but the fact is that the third round happened, and that is already an achievement, meaning that the multilateral dialogue with Turkey as intermediary, it continues. And we cannot say that this meeting has to bring a certain meeting, not just Istanbul, that it has to only give the maximum result, right? We see it's a step-by-step process. And let these be humanitarian tracks that are, of course, important. It's about health and life of people and military detainees and children. It's already progress. So, let us say so, readiness of one of the parties to ceasing fire, that is one issue, so to say. And from the other side, if Ukraine is ready for that, Russia might agree, but at least to have joint positions and to mention that to other parties. They have to be present, and I think that it's absolutely normal negotiation process. And this situation is not the exclusion. So I think that we should wait and consider the progress and how the situation develops. If there will be some further rounds like Istanbul or any other platforms, it depends on the development of the situation. But if hypothetically, yeah, we can talk about that. But in this case, we take the practical side into account, what we've got. So we have the third round conducted. So step by step, we move forward. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, any other questions from the audience? Okay, then I thank to all the speakers, I thank to the authors of the research, and we will hope that this research will impact decision making of MFA of Ukraine and also that will impact our partners. Thank you. I would like to remind you that we had presentation of research from Ukrainian Center for Independent Political Research and War Observe, dedicated to actually negotiations regarding the end of Russian-Ukrainian war. Thank you.